From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is Update One, the club's official podcast. It features newsworthy stories originating from the NPC facilities, as well as broader topics related to journalism, communications, press freedom, and transparency.
Welcome, everyone, to the National Press Club's Update One podcast. I'm Gemma Puglisi with the club's broadcast committee, and today we discuss our very own journalist. A recent report release found that there has been a surge in journalist arrests. Last year, in 2024, nearly 48 arrests took place during demonstrations, and that included the Israel-Gaza war protest. The report was the work of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And here to share more details on what this all means is Kirstin McCudden, Vice President of Editorial for Freedom of the Press Foundation and Managing Editor of one of its projects, the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. Now, I want to note that this database, the tracker is a database, and I'm taking this from their website. It is a database of press freedom incidents in the United States, and it covers everything from arrests of journalists, the seizure of their equipment, assaults, and interrogations at the U.S. border. The Press Freedom Tracker documents incidents across the country involving national, state, and local authorities. Welcome, Kirstin. Thank you very much for being here today.
Hi, Gemma. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
So tell us briefly, before we get started on the tracker, what is the Freedom of the Press Foundation and what does it do?
Freedom of the Press Foundation is a nonprofit, put simply, dedicated to the fight for press freedom.
Right.
Since 2012, we've evolved to maintain secure communication tools, like SecureDrop, for example, used by investigative news organizations. And SecureDrop is a whistleblower submission system. It helps to protect journalists and sources so that they can communicate with each other. Right. Freedom of the Press Foundation is also on the ground with our digital security training team. We're training journalists across the U.S., across the globe, in how to protect themselves and their sources really in this ever-changing digital age. And another project, as you mentioned, the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. There, we monitor nearly every press freedom violation in the United States since 2017.
All right. Thank you for sharing that. So this is really quite alarming, Kirstin. So we know how devastating it is, right, to see journalists being detained in other countries. But this is happening here in our own country. So when we look at this report, right, and do you want to share with everybody where they can find this information? It's www.pressfreedomtracker.us. Okay, thank you. So when we're looking at this report, there have been some years that have seen higher arrests than others, right? I think it says in 2020, right, there were about 150 journalists, and then 2022 to 2023, not so much as this past year that we just saw, 2024. But tell us a little bit about that. What did we see in 2024?
So in 2024, we saw what we consider a surge of journalist arrests, nearly 50, as you mentioned. That's across the United States from January all the way to the end of the year. Journalists being arrested, detained, or charged with a crime. As you mentioned, the majority of those happened at protests. And that's a theme that we'll see over the years at the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. And it was true for 2024, mostly around Israel-Gaza conflict protests, war protests, a lot of them on college campuses throughout the year. And journalists who were covering those demonstrations were often, most often in our documentation, arrested or detained while covering protests.
So let me ask you, I was also looking at, it's just amazing and fascinating information. The two biggest states were what, California and New York, I think I noticed. And in another section, it is all categories, right? You have arrests, criminal charges, 24 or so. And then the one thing that also stood out, you have the assaults, the denial of access, the equipment damage, which happened to be a very big number, like about 12, right, when you're looking at the different numbers. But what really stood out for me was the chilling statements. And in that, when you're explaining what that category was, and it said there were about 74 incidences total, it says that this is public threats that are made to reporters and media organizations by U.S. politicians and other public figures, which can have a chilling effect on journalism. Can you speak a little bit more about that? That's a pretty staggering number from all the different categories.
It is. And that's sort of why the tracker is so special and so important, is that it puts all of these press freedom violations into context. So we can talk about chilling statements. And, Gemma, what's amazing about that category, it's actually only select threats. We do not document every single threat from all politicians. It's just the very big ones so that we're capturing them. But what is so special about the tracker and why it's such a great resource, and I really encourage everyone to open it up, play with the data, and see what Gemma and I are talking about here, is that it helps you understand year over year what's happening to the state of press freedom in the United States. It really helps contextualize it. The chilling statements, as you're talking about, the assaults, the arrests against journalists. Another category that we track in is subpoenas. Those are sort of threats to press freedom coming at you from the legal side. So an assault can be a police officer shoving a journalist. It can also be a member of the public shoving a journalist. And then you have these very physical activities, the assaults, the detainments, the arrest, and then other ways of chilling or slowing reporting, like subpoenas, like prior restraints. And what we do at the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker is put them into categories and document so that we can all use it as a resource and see what's going on.
So how did you learn about all this? You touched on it a little bit. Did you hear from journalists to say, this is what happened to me? Are you looking at, the daily, arrests, or just looking locally at what you're hearing? Are you hearing from the various news organizations, picking up the phone saying, hey, listen, we just had several journalists being attacked? How do you get all this information on the tracker?
Oh my gosh, all of it. Exactly what you were talking about. It's this multi-pronged reporting approach. It's a news site, and our reporters work to cultivate sources with news organizations, with freelance individual reporters who are on the ground. We have about 36 partners, NPC being one of them, who really work with us to say, hey, this happened to one of our members. SPJ is a good example. First Amendment Coalition saying, well, we're hearing about this in California. Journalists received a subpoena. You should document it. Incredible network of partners. We also have a tips portal. Anybody can submit a tips. It's on our website. Also, all of our social media, DM us, and our tip lines are there. You can say, I just heard about it, even if it didn't happen to you. So it doesn't have to be about you as a journalist. It can be something that you also read or came across, and we take all of that and then we begin the reporting from there. So it's both push and pull as well. So we're doing our own, we're always watching protests, for example. So during the Democratic National Convention, the Republican National Convention, we're on call those nights, watching to see journalists who are covering it. Are they caught up in a police kettle in Chicago or Milwaukee? What's happening to them on the ground, as well as really working across the board to receive information.
So as a professor, and we teach journalism and communication, what advice do you have for us as young, new reporters go out there and cover these important news stories, what advice can you give them in terms of how to prepare themselves and what they should be aware of when they are covering this? It's they have their badges and they are there, but what advice do you recommend and do you suggest for them so that they are prepared when they are covering these stories?
That's a great question, especially when you're an emerging journalist and you're new to being on the ground for fast-moving events. But even if you're a seasoned veteran journalist, these things all hold true. One is situational awareness, and you can start ahead of time. FPF, Freedom of the Press Foundation, we have the digital training team, but we also publish a ton of guides. So you can start raising your digital security awareness before you go out. And that means, what does that mean? It's like hardening a phone. If you are reporting on your phone or it's one of multiple devices you have while you're out on the field and you drop your phone, have you prepared it so that nobody else can get into it? If you are arrested and it is taken by the police, which is part of the normal course of being arrested, do you have it locked so that way it cannot be opened when it's out of your possession, no matter who has it? So there are all these things you can do ahead of time to protect yourself and your sources. But, it's really that situational awareness. Every jurisdiction is different. Knowing where you're going and the rules of the time. Is it a declared protest? Or is there a curfew? Are journalists exempt from that curfew? Have they explicitly stated it? The LA fires recently is a great example of police and fire department saying journalists are exempt and being very upfront and working with the press clubs and organizations there to be very clear with that. But if it's not clear, find it out. A few other things you can do: know what that legal hotline is in case you get arrested or detained. Know in advance the numbers you will want to call professionally in addition to personally. And really, if you're part of a newsroom, talk to your editor, if you have one, about where you're going. Somebody should be aware at all times. And if you're not part of a larger newsroom, a freelancer, have a peer group set up for safety reasons.
So thank you very much. So let's say I am a journalist and I am arrested. What is the process? I mean, do you call your assignment you get the one phone call, right? What do you call the assignment desk? How do you prepare for that, or what are your rights so that and of course, does it remain on your record? And how I'm now going into legalities, right? I'm going into all these legalities. So if you can just briefly kind of guide us on that.
Yeah, and I'll say every situation is different. So every time a journalist is arrested is slightly different from the time before, but these things will hold across. State that you're press and state it clearly. So not everybody chooses to wear a lanyard, and that really is, again, about the situation. And that's your choice. If you have credentials, having them on you somewhere, even if it's in your wallet or in your back pocket, and verbalizing. And if you don't have those, verbalizing with during this detainment or kettling or arrest that you are press really sets the foundation for helping in the future to establish that you were there in a journalistic capacity. So I'd say that's the number one thing. If it's not very obvious from your actions or your body, then verbalize it when the event is happening. But otherwise, whether you call your assigning editor or call your mother, call me, or a friend or Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press as legal hotlines, that's what you would want to have determined ahead of time. What is your plan of action going to be that's best for you?
We touched on news organizations, right? We've touched on them. Has the organization also worked, because we're seeing an increase, right, in all these arrests, has the foundation organization worked with news organizations more diligently, I guess I should say, or connect with them more so now because we're seeing these numbers?
What we have seen, what I've heard from our digital security training team here at FPF is that the request for trainings has increased. And so I know, we're really it's going above and beyond to meet that demand and to work with as many journalists as we can. National Press Club, Journalism Institute also has trainers, and across the board, there are different types of trainers, some digital security, some physical awareness, working together to make sure that journalists are prepared. But we have seen an increase in the request for trainers.
So when this report came out, and we should say that it came out at the very end of 2024, and it was released, what kind of feedback did you get? I'm just curious. What kind of response did you get from this report?
Yeah, so it's our annual report. At the end of the year, we look at all the arrests, and we try to put into context for journalists, for academics, for our press freedom community, what the previous year looked like, specifically for arrests, because we know they have, I'll call it a longer tail. You were mentioned that earlier, like, will it stay on your record? What charges are still pending? At the very least, if you're arrested or detained while reporting, you're stopped at that moment from reporting. So it has all of these effects, which is why we write this annual report. And this year, there was a lot of surprise at how the number has more than doubled over last year and is the last 2 years combined. We had a little bit of an early warning of this. I write a monthly newsletter that does just this, looks at all of our categories and says, like, what's going on. Those protests were happening in April and May, and we had a sense then that it was going to be a higher
number than it was in the past.
Right. Now, we also knew it was an election year, right? So there was a lot of big events going on in 2024.
Thank you so much. And just one last question, because I thought it was interesting. Did you also say that the the tracker also was there and also taking a look at sources and whistleblowers? Do you want to just chat about that just really briefly, of how they are being protected as well?
Yeah, I would love to. So it's actually one of our projects here at Freedom of the Press Foundation. We maintain and build on Secure Job, which is a secure whistleblowing system. It allows sources, whistleblowers, and journalists to safely communicate in an encrypted manner. So that way files and communication can be shared between the two. Now, Secure Drop is downloaded by major news organizations. You've heard of a lot of names, as well as individual journalists. What's sort of funny about Secure Drop is, by its very nature, we don't know all the stories that it breaks. That's not even for us to look at. But we have a robust engineering team, and they work to make sure that Secure Drop works for journalists.
Great. And any closing thoughts, Kirstin, just to show your support for journalists? Any closing thoughts that you may have as we enter this new year ahead? What would you like to say to journalists?
As a journalist myself, I do want to press how important it is to speak up when something like an assault happens to you while you are reporting, or if you receive a subpoena for your communications, or if you are kept out of a meeting that should be open and you've been denied access. Often, journalists, we don't like being the middle, like the center of the story. I'm always like, no, I belong behind the camera, not in front of it. But what we have seen year over year by having the tracker and documenting in it is that you are not alone. This might be happening to someone else, and that allowing us to report on it and to document it is about the bigger state of press freedom in the United States.
Thank you, Kirstin. And again, it's www.pressfreedomtracker.us. That will be it for us today. Thank you so much, Kirstin McCudden with the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and for all the work that you do to help journalists. I also want to thank my colleagues here at the National Press Club for their help with this podcast, Mike Hempen and Adam Cano. From all of us here at the National Press Club, I'm Gemma Puglisi, and thank you for listening.
You have been listening to Update One, the official podcast of the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists and a vigorous advocate of press freedom worldwide. If you have any questions or comments about Update One, send an email to updateonepodcast@gmail.com.